Are we living in an era with more revolutionary change than has been the case during the past? The answer is yes.
Learning for me is entirely about behaviour change.
If you have those problems and you decide the answer to those problems is to think about employee engagement, you're rather missing the point.
Organisations are changing. The world is changing, the demographics are changing, who we trade with is changing.
We tend to mobilise head office, central teams, go through top-down change that we roll out on the organisation. So why is it we're surprised when there's high resistance and a lack of buy-in to what we're selling?
If you look at digital native businesses like Amazon, Airbnb, they don't talk about transformation because they were born digital.
Hi, and welcome to the Business Transformation Network's podcast. The BTN is an online media platform and job board focusing on transformational content, which we break down into three main categories: people, process, and technology. We host free events around these topics with experts in their field, and this podcast is brought to you by the BTN and their editor and your host, me, Emma McDermott. As always, if you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. All links from this podcast will be provided with the description on iTunes, Audible, or whichever app you listen to your podcasts on. This Business Transformation Network podcast is brought to you in partnership with Sage People. Sage People enable mid-size multinational companies to manage their workforce through its global cloud HR and people system, which transforms how your organisation acquires, engages, manages and develops your employees.
Today with us we have Susanne Evans, who is a coach and consultant, and she is going to be talking to us about using storytelling to drive change. So let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today, Susanne. Could you please introduce yourself and what you do to our listeners?
Hi, and thank you for having me on. I'm really looking forward to chatting to you. My name is Susanne Evans and I am a consultant and a coach, particularly in the area of organisation change, but actually also storytelling in organisations and how organisations can use story to make change more successful. My background is in Big Four consulting, so I did that for 10 years. And then 13 years ago, I set up my own business, Feldspar Consulting, to carry on with the work that I was doing, but perhaps try and do things in a slightly different way. And that's how the storytelling thing entered my life. And last year, I actually finished a PhD in organisation change and storytelling. So I use that a lot to inform my work. So today I can certainly talk a bit about some of the research that I've done and what I found out.
Amazing. So as you just mentioned there, we're going to talk about storytelling and how it can drive change. So if we just go straight in, so it's commonly known that storytelling is an enormous part of the human experience, but can it be beneficial in the workplace?
It really can. And as you say, there's been a lot of research and study done in how stories work and how the human brain reacts to stories. And of course, that carries through from normal life into work life. I think they've shown that about 2/3 of communications outside of work are story-based, but at work that switches around, so it's only 1/3 of communications. But people react better to stories than they do to facts. So the human brain remembers something told in a story about 7 times more than if they're just told a series of facts. So, of course, in an organisation context, if you're trying to communicate or you're trying to lead a change or just do everyday stuff, if you're able to build story into your work, then people are likely to remember the messages that you tell them more. They'll also engage with it better. So there's lots of research to show that employees who are told about a change in an organisation through story rather than through fact-based communications, they have a higher level of engagement with the information, but also with the thing that's happening. And it's a great way of inspiring people to change and create action. So it's really, I'm very passionate about it as something that really makes a difference in organisations. I've seen it in action and I've seen it work in lots of different organisations, and but I think it's sometimes something that people feel it's difficult to do. So a lot of my work is helping leaders and managers in organisations to feel more confident in telling stories and using them as part of their communications.
And so I know you talk a lot in your work about the different types of business stories. So what are they and how can they be used?
There's loads of different stories, and I think there's different ways of looking at it. Often it's really helpful just to tell a story about a particular situation that's relevant. But also there are specific stories that are quite useful in a business context. There's an amazing book written by Mike Adams, which is the 7 stories every salesperson must tell. And in there he outlines 7 stories, which are really useful for people to think about in terms of growing their business and working in a corporate context. There's, I think, 3 that I probably teach most in the work that I do. And often I'm working with small businesses who are trying to grow their network and do more business, obviously, get more clients. And so there's a couple of stories that are really relevant to them. The first one is the who are you story. So this is kind of an origin story. It's explaining who you are and why you do what you do. And it's something that I see a lot of organisations getting wrong, because quite often organisations go into a sort of a historical sort of set of dates. You know, we were formed on this date and we have this many clients and our turnover is this much. And actually that's far less engaging than really talking about why it is that you do the work that you do, what led you to this path, who are you people, and why should I work with you? So that who are you piece is really important. It's also really important for individuals, thinking about job interviews and about when you meet people for the first time, to be able to have that really clear story of what drives you and what led you to this point is really important and very engaging for people. The second one that often I teach organisations is the why should I work with you story. Now, classically in organisations, and I've done this myself back in the day, when you are trying to convince a company or a client to work with you, you give them some case studies of work that you have done. And in that, you'll describe the problem that the client had and what you did to fix it. Mike Adams argues that actually we need to turn that on its head. So when we're trying to convince people to work with us, it's not about us. It's not about the work that we did or that I did. It's about what we can do to help our clients. So we should be thinking a lot more about success stories. We should be showing how we are a guide, how we guided our clients rather than doing work for them. And he likens it to the difference, if you're a Star Wars fan, between Yoda and Luke Skywalker. So Yoda is the guide. He doesn't do the things for the company. So when we're thinking about telling a why should I work with you story, it's showing the person you're talking to why you would be a good guide to them. And the difference in that story as compared to a case study is it's talking about the things that went wrong and the potential pitfalls, as well as all the stuff that went right. So it's a much more authentic story. And I think the third story that's most important in my work is the why should I change story. As I said at the beginning, a big part of my work is around organisation change. And it's about helping leaders and managers tell a story about why should somebody change, what's in it for them, what's this new world going to look like. And I use a model by David Rock quite a lot here called the SCARF model, where he goes through the various elements that people need to know in this story of change, so that they feel comfortable and safe with what's happening. So that's a really important one for me. I think it's about telling a really consistent story about what the future is going to look like and really making that feel real for people. So again, not just a list of facts about what's going to change, but what is it going to feel like to work in this organisation in the future? What's every day going to feel like? I had a client recently who did this brilliantly by a series of cartoons. So they interviewed people in the organisation and then created cartoons about what their day looked like before the change and then what their day looked like after the change. And that's a really great way of explaining what's going to be different.
Obviously, storytelling can be useful to drive change in the workplace, like you just said. So in a number of these podcasts, you'll hear me, or the listeners would have heard me, quote the varying percentages of failure in business. So how can storytelling make change more successful within business?
Yeah, I think, well, I'm sure you've covered this before, but it's no one really seems to know how many changes fail. But what we do know is change can be hard, and it's hard for organisations to get the benefit that they want, and it's hard for individuals and organisations to get the benefit of change. As I said before, I think there's lots of data to show that stories are much more engaging. for individuals to hear, rather than just being bombarded with a set of facts. The thing that got me into storytelling in the first place was actually during a change program I was working on about 9 years ago. And it was a huge culture change, complete change and transformation to this big utilities business. And what the board decided to do was to equip all of the leaders with the tools that they needed to really tell the story about what was happening and what it meant for them. And instead of the sort of typical thing, which they'd be given a slide deck and they'd be sent out to sort of cascade the information out to their teams, they had trainers in to teach these people how to tell a story. So they were still given the slides, but they were taught to tell a story around those slides. So why is this happening? What is the endpoint going to look like? What does this mean for me? Why am I excited about it? And over the course of a couple of days, they really developed and honed this story that they were going to go out and communicate the change with. And what I saw in that, when they went out and did it, first of all, the leaders were a lot more engaged in the process and more excited about giving this information out to people. And secondly, when they did their team meetings and a cascade of all this information, it was obvious that employees were more engaged. They were keen to find out more. There was less fear about what was coming because it was being talked about in a really human way. And so for me, that was when I first started to realise that change can be hard, but using stories to communicate it can really help. The other side of this is what came out of my PhD research, is that there's an awful lot of stuff going on in an organisation below the surface, a bit like an iceberg, all of which impacts on the organisation and the way it can change in the future. It almost acts like an anchor to keep it in the past. And by gathering stories, so it's slightly different approach here. It's not telling stories, it's listening to stories from within the business. You can get a really good understanding of some of this other stuff that's going on in the organisation that might act as an anchor or a difficulty in moving the organisation forward, particularly around stuff that's happened in the past. So a big issue, I suppose, for a lot of organisations is around resistance to change and change fatigue. And this can often be caused by stories that are being told about change in the past. I bet a lot of people listening to this podcast will have, done change programs and will have experienced employees going, oh, not again, or we did this 10 years ago. But actually trying to listen to some of these stories and gathering them can be a really interesting way of finding out what's going on in the organisation, and then you can work with that to move it forward. So my approach is very much around using story to communicate change, but then also gathering and listening to story to understand how the organisation actually functions in reality.
I suppose as it stands at the moment, this is sort of predominantly a concept that we're talking about. But how can you bring it into reality? Like, how can you alter the culture or the leadership to embrace this and start actively using it?
Well, I think it's about becoming more conscious of stories that are in the organisation. We as humans, as we said at the beginning, we are storytelling beasts. We tell stories all the time. You think about when you come back from holiday and someone might say, oh, how was your holiday? Back in the day when we did that sort of thing, you can say, well, how was your holiday? And you tell a story about what happened. We all do this all the time. I think so. Part of using it consciously is noticing when you hear stories around you, and get better at spotting a story when you hear it. So a story typically has a beginning, middle, and end. It's set in a time and in a place. There are a number of characters in it, one of which could be you. And then also there's some kind of emotion. And that's quite important, is there's some kind of, emotion that happens in the story. You think about movies, they have that classic kind of structure of an arc of emotions. You meet the people who are in the story, and then something goes wrong, and then they try and make it better, and then they triumph at the end. That is the sort of classic story structure. But I think when you're starting out on this journey, it's easy to become phased by the idea that your story has to be a sort of movie plot, and it doesn't. So if you're trying to communicate something to somebody, is there a way that you can build in a story or an example that helps to illustrate what the point that you're trying to get across, rather than just a series of facts? And I think it's also about encouraging this environment in organisations of dialogue, and conversation. So much of leadership and of change leadership in particular is around advocacy of the change rather than inquiring about what people think about it. So I think a big part of becoming more adept at using story in your work is to invite that dialogue and conversation, listen to what you hear, and then see if there's things you can take from that in the work that you're doing. And I think, for a lot of leaders, this feels different, it perhaps feels hard. But I think the best thing with stories is to have a bit of fun with it. Think of some stories you could tell, practice them in safe situations, and then try them out and see what happens. A colleague of mine, David Lee, who's a huge kind of force in this field of storytelling, he recommends keeping a log of stories that you hear and almost indexing them by what you could use them for, so that you can then search for and use different stories in different situations. But for me, the biggest thing is to start to notice when you hear a story, notice when you tell a story, and notice what happens.
From there, I just had a thought. Is there a part in this that needs to sort of consider people's, and more particularly leaders, I suppose, but their emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think there's almost like a vulnerability in telling a story, because it's stepping away from that script, isn't it? Of to tell somebody about something that's happening, or let's read from this script and tell the troops what's going on. And I think there's a part of showing yourself to your team, which can be quite hard for some leaders to do. And I think it's also, as you said, having that EQ to be able to determine the situation that you're in and what's appropriate. So there's definitely a part of building that side of yourself, so that you feel more confident in revealing more of yourself perhaps to people, and then feel more confident about when's the right situation to tell a story.
Yeah, absolutely, I would agree on that. And so in the case of using storytelling in driving business change, do they have to be true stories or experiences, or can they be a tale of fiction?
You would be amazed how often I'm asked this question. So ideally, any story that you tell should be true. It's much easier to tell something that feels authentically you if it's something that either happened to you or it's something that someone has told you about. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with using stories that happened to somebody else, but you have to tell it as, a friend of mine or a colleague of mine did this, that, and the other. If you start to use things that are fictional, it becomes like a fable or an analogy, and they're fine to a point. So there's various storytelling books out there that use sort of stories about animals as analogies for change, and they're fine. But actually, if you're really trying to drive a change in behaviour, it's much better to tell a story about a person, and ideally something that happened to you or something that you observed. So my advice is always tell the truth, tell something that really happened, and don't try and carry off a story that isn't yours as your own. And a colleague of mine was telling me the other day that they heard someone tell a story that they said had happened to them, and it was very interesting, and they enjoyed hearing it. And then a few weeks later, somebody else told them exactly the same story as though it had happened to them. And of course, when that happened, all of the sort of legitimacy of the first person has gone, because they've been revealed as telling a story and telling a lie. Whereas if they told the story about, I heard about this that happened to someone else, then that would be fine. Stick to the truth would be my advice.
Absolutely, I'd agree. And so we've had sort of a lot of conversation here around transparency and honesty, and that's also the sort of conversation that's going on in businesses at the moment. So how can you ensure that people know that you're being authentic when you're telling these stories?
I mean, authentic leadership is just massively important. And I think going back to the point I was making earlier about vulnerability, I think in all of this, there is that need to show your true self. And so going back to what I said before about telling stories from your own experience, that is a great way of revealing as much of yourself as you're comfortable with, and a great way to build rapport with people and to share experiences. So I think it's quite easy. We're pretty good, our humans are, at telling whether somebody's telling the truth or not. And I think if you're able to build in personal anecdotes and and make your story detailed enough to have the information in it that allows people to tell whether it's true or not. That's the best way. And if you're trying to be more authentic at work, there is no better way to do that than to share some stories of your own experiences with others, for the right reason, of course. I mean, with all this around authentic leadership, there's the danger of tripping into kind of oversharing. So any business story always has to have a purpose. There has to be a business purpose to whatever it is that you're saying. It's not just you telling random stories about things that have happened in your life. So but if you're able to find a story that illustrates a purpose for you, then there's no better way to be authentic.
Yeah, I would agree there. And so some people are incredible storytellers that sort of grab your attention, and I can think of a few from my personal experience, but others don't find it so easy or natural and like go off on tangents or get a little bit stuck. So not everyone is a natural sort of born storyteller, as it were. So is there a secret to helping someone become more comfortable in sort of telling or retelling stories and drawing that sort of attention?
It's really funny because I think everyone thinks that they're not a very good storyteller, and actually most people are. But I think there's this kind of there's a sort of myth of performance around storytelling. So it's a bit like, being on stage or being in a film. And actually, the day-to-day stories that we all tell are not like that at all. They're not like this great cinematic production. I think it's, if people are feeling unsure about it, then there's a way you can use a structure of a story. So thinking about the beginning, the middle and the end, and actually writing stuff down before, if you feel a bit uncertain, before you have to communicate something, or if you're thinking, I'd like to build a story into this thing I've got to do, but I don't know how, then write it. Instead of doing it off the cuff, write it down, practice it a few times, practice it on a friendly audience and get them to give you some feedback on, how did it land with you? How did you feel when I was telling it? That sort of thing can really help you feel more confident. And also, I think, listen to other people and note when they're telling stories. Often people find it difficult to get in and out of a story. So when do you start the story? You don't want to start by saying, let me tell you a story, or once upon a time, because that doesn't feel quite right. So take a note of how other people start and finish stories and see if you can learn things from that. What I quite like to do is to start a story with setting it in a time and a place. So I said at the beginning, that's quite important. And so I'll quite often say, about 10 years ago or 8 years ago, or I was in this place and this happened. That's good in two ways. It's a good way to get into the story from your perspective without having to do something cheesy like once upon a time or let me tell you a story. But it also lets the listener know that you're about to tell them the story, so they're ready to hear it, which is really good. So yeah, I would say do some preparation, do some practice. Going back to what I said before about noticing more stories around you, start gathering them so you've got a little note or a log of stories so that you can use them. Something I find quite difficult is sometimes pulling a story from my head in a particular situation or in the moment. So I think if you've got a little log or a file on your computer where you make a note of things, it just makes you feel more confident that you've got something that you can use in different situations.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And so often there's a lot of positive affirmation in storytelling, but can you tell a negative story and it still sort of help? And how can that also help drive change?
You definitely can. I've been doing some quite interesting work recently looking at innovation stories. So rather than change, how organisations tell stories about innovation, but also how they can become more innovative through storytelling. And when you look at some of these, like Dyson, for example, the story of how the Dyson was invented is a catalogue of things that went wrong. I think he had something like 5,000 prototypes or something before he actually hit on the Dyson that worked. And if you go onto the Dyson website, you can read their story in full. And it very clearly outlines all the stuff that went wrong, but it tells it in a way to show, first of all, that it's been well developed, and that's how innovation works. You don't ever get it right first time. So it shows really how the organisation was founded and how the process was undertaken to create what is a really great product. So there's lots of, I suppose you might call it negative stories in that kind of innovation space about trial and error and things that went wrong and lessons learned. And for me, I think that's the most important thing about telling a story that has negative aspects. It's then moving it into that kind of positive frame of, well, how can we learn a lesson from that for the future? So thinking about change, I talked about change fatigue and the history of change earlier. If an organisation has had a bit of a checkered history in how change has been introduced or managed, there's no point pretending that didn't happen. But you can go back to it in your story about this new change and talk about what's going to be different and how things have moved on and what lessons have been learned. There's a lot of work in the area of psychological safety and how creating an environment in organisations where risks can be taken, mistakes can be made, and that's okay is really important. So I think these kind of negative stories can be a really important part of creating this culture of authenticity, but also where people feel that it's okay to get stuff wrong as long as you learn from it and it doesn't happen again. I think the other point I wanted to make about the negative story is that I referred earlier to this kind of story arc of emotion that happens in a movie or in a film or in a book, where you have that sort of the protagonist who is introduced and then something terrible happens and then they work to deal with it, and then there's a happy ending at the end. Jennifer Aker has done some fantastic research on that kind of emotion, the emotion that the person watching a story or reading a story goes through when they listen or watch to something like that. And it's that emotion that drives action. So interestingly, if you are trying to really drive some behaviour change in the organisation or trying to create something different or moving into a different space in the future, having that kind of arc of emotion of when things went wrong and how they're going to be better, it can be a really fantastic way of building engagement. And I think the idea that stories have to be positive all the time is it's not actually that authentic, because life isn't like that. So I think it's actually really important to build both aspects of story into any stories that you're trying to tell.
And so I know we've just touched on the more sort of negative note, as it were, but there's sort of also a really important piece here about reframing experiences to sort of provide the message that you want. So how can you tackle the concept of resistance and obstacles to change through storytelling?
I think resistance is a really interesting area because it's something where my own thinking has changed quite considerably over the period of time when I was doing my PhD research. So when I first started out in change, 20 odd years ago, I definitely saw resistance to change as something that was difficult and was stopping me from getting my job done. And I had lots of stories of resistant acts that people had undertaken in on change programs that I'd worked on and how difficult that had been. Actually, as I've sort of gone through the research that I've been doing and reflected on what I found out, I've sort of had to reframe myself of how I see resistance. And I almost now see it as like super engagement, because if you're engaged enough in the change process to resist and to question and to ask questions, then to me that is super engagement in the process. The person could just have not been interested at all and been apathetic about it, but they're not. They're negative or resistant to change. Well, that's good. So my thinking on this has changed now to really being that actually we should engage with these people, and stories are a great way to do that. So you can get people together, talk to them about their experience of working in the organisation, listen to what they have to say about the change process and what are they resistant to. Is it the change? Is it the process? Is it the organisation? Is it something else? But to actually engage with people through asking them to share their story can be so powerful, listening to what the stories are being told. I think it was Charles Duhigg said, the more stories you listen to, the more patterns you will see. And if you take the time to actually engage with resistors, and I'm doing air quotes when I say that, you can find out where they're at and get them to share their experience. I think what I've learned is that a lot of people who are resistant to change just need more information. It isn't that they don't like what's happening. They just haven't been told enough for them to feel comfortable with what's going on. So it's great to engage and talk to these people so that you can build the messages that they're telling you into the communications and into your change process. Also, as I said earlier, I think this idea of getting underneath what's going on in the organisation is really important, to find out what are some of these obstacles to change. I was working in an organisation a few months ago, and they were telling me that there were lots of stories in that organisation about things that had been done in the past and how great the past was, this kind of nostalgic view of how marvellous things used to be. But when they actually started to talk to some of the people who were telling these stories, they discovered that these stories dated from years ago. And actually, the people who were telling the stories hadn't even witnessed any of these things that had happened. And yet, they were still there. The stories were still there. These kind of key players and key figures in the organisation who'd left many years ago were still being talked about. And this golden past was still being considered. That could have been a huge obstacle to change if they hadn't uncovered it. But actually, by questioning and talking and engaging in dialogue and conversation, they discovered some of these things that were going on, some of the stories that were being told. And then they can then tailor their communications and activities appropriately to try and bust some of these myths and these stories that were hanging around from years ago and actually weren't really benefiting the organisation at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I would completely agree on that point. And so sort of to conclude and wrap it up, Susanne, if our listeners only took away one thing from today, what would you recommend?
For me, I think it's about noticing, having that attention on what's going on in the organisation, what's going on around you, what are people saying, what stories are you hearing from people who work with you? And start to really listen to some of that stuff. As I said before, I think there's a lot of talk in organisations. Everyone talks all the time, but actually how much of that is a sort of two-way conversation? And I think taking the opportunity to really give attention to what's happening, you can start to pick up clues about how people are feeling. Some of this underneath things that go on in the organisation aren't there on the surface. If you start to notice some of the conversations more, it'll give you clues as to what that is, and you can then use that in your leadership and in your communications to make change land better, and also to engage people. And I think I'm going to say more than one thing because I've just thought of something else. I hope that's okay. But I think it is trying to find an opportunity to build story into every communication that you have to do. So if you're any sort of big communication that you're planning on doing in the organisation, if there's any opportunity to, instead of just telling people a list of facts, is there a way to build in an anecdote or an example or a small story just to make it land a bit better? And I think the more you can do that, the easier it will become, and it will become more natural and more part of your everyday work.
Amazing. I think that's some great food for thought there. So thank you so much for your time today, Susanne.
You're very welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed it or learned something. For more content like this, please subscribe to the BTN website. As always, we really appreciate any thoughts and feedback about the show. You can reach us on Twitter @thebusinesstn, or you can email us at emma@thebtn.tv with any questions or suggestions for future episodes. We read all emails and will always try to respond as soon as possible. This episode is sponsored by Sage People. Thanks.